Hello and welcome to Pathways, where you are invited to join me for a visit with leaders in personal development and cultural evolution. This is your host, Paul O'Brien. Grief is hard, and it's made even more difficult by inaccurate information that our culture spreads about it. When your grief is dismissed or criticized by friends, or when you believe myths about it and hold yourself to some false standard of how to properly grieve, you can end up feeling not only the astounding pain from your loss, but also fear or shame about how you are managing your emotions. Our guest today is Candyce Ossefort-Russell, author of the ebook, Your Grief is Your Own, Dispelling Common Myths About Grief. She is a psychotherapist, grief advocate, writer, therapist trainer, and speaker. She has actively lived, studied, and trained in psychological, spiritual, and scientific perspectives of suffering and transformation for over 25 years and has extensive experience living through, working with, and writing about trauma, grief, and life transition. Known for her warm and emotionally engaged therapy and teaching style, Candyce is a contributor to the forthcoming book, Clinical Applications of the Polyvagal Theory. And maybe that's something we'll learn a little bit about today. Hello, Candyce, and welcome to the Pathways Show.
Hi, Paul. I'm happy to be here.
Why don't we start by asking you to share with us your own personal experience of grief, which had a lot to do with you becoming a grief counselor.
Okay. Yes, when I had my son 26 years ago, and when I had him, I was in career transition, so I stayed home with him. And when he was 9 months old, my husband suddenly got ill. My husband was a healthy 30, healthy runner in his 30s, and he suddenly got sick, went to the ICU overnight, and never came home. He was sick and in the hospital for 6 weeks. And so it was a very sudden illness and death. And so when my son was 11 months old to the day, my husband died. And I was fortunate enough to have the means to go work with a therapist at that time who helped me through all those dark times. And I was fortunate enough to find a therapist who had not subscribed to the cultural view of grief occurring in some sort of specific stages or in a specific period of time. And she was really just fearless about being with me through whatever dark places this grief process guided me. And consequently, I actually learned a lot about what grief does to help us heal, how going down and through the experience of our grief leads to a lot of growth, and that actually that's what we're wired for once we do have a loss. And so after about 5 years, I realized in my career transition that I was ready to be a therapist myself, that I wanted to help other people in these dark places because I had a lot of experience with it.
Well, based on your ebook and your website, I'm glad that you made that decision. I'm curious, though, about something you just said. I'm wondering, how does a therapist be with you through your grief?
Hmm? That's a good question. Um, the best way I can describe it is that you sit with someone in whatever their emotion is and let them know that you understand in whatever way this person needs to be understood. And what happens a lot, and why I think it's hard for even therapists sometimes to sit with grief, is there's an emotional resonance between us humans. I'm sure that you've had the experience when you're with a friend who's feeling sad or something, you can sort of tear up alongside your friend. That what actually helps us as humans with social brains to feel like we can manage our emotions is to feel felt. Interpersonal neurobiology founder Daniel Siegel talks about feeling felt. Feeling felt means that you can tell another person resonates with and understands your inner world. So as a therapist, being with someone when they're in their very deep places of sadness, it doesn't mean that I am going to start sobbing along with them, but I'm going to let their sadness affect me. I'm going to feel that sadness alongside them, and they're going to see it in my eyes. And I'm going to say, can you tell that I'm here with you right now? And that can help people feel really understood. Another aspect of it, though, is that I talk about in my grief book is that our ability to handle the intense emotions of grief is tied to both our physiology, how intensely we feel our emotions, and our history, that where we've learned whether painful emotions are okay or shameful. So sometimes what happens is people will start to feel their sadness or their anger, for example, and then they shut themselves down because they're having an unconscious memory of being shamed for having, crying or something. And
Right.
so
In other words, they had a parent who wasn't very good at feeling their feelings.
that's right. And so their sadness gets kind of short shrift because they get embarrassed or something. So in that moment, I might help somebody to really understand, like, it looks like it's hard for you to let yourself go there here with me. And we do some work around that. So I don't want to make it sound like I just force people to cry and then I'm there with them, because it's not. I have to being with people means finding what their comfort level is and then helping them notice what their comfort level is.
And can you do this as a therapist long distance? Can you do it through Skype or over the phone?
You can. It actually works a lot better if you do it in person, because that empathic resonance where you feel with, it can work via Skype because you can see face to face. It can work over the phone because you do get nonverbal signals through hearing. But being in the room with somebody face to face is actually the most helpful.
Now, it seems to me that in order to be a therapist of this type, or a therapist perhaps of any type, one would have to have a pretty high level of empathy.
Yes.
But even if you have a high level of empathy, it still must be kind of exhausting.
Well, you have to, I think that's why you have to have more than empathy. You have to have a high level of empathy, and I think you also have to have done a lot of your own internal work. I mean, I actually think nobody should be a therapist before they've had like a good 5 to 7 years of their own therapy. Because being in therapy, you start to get to know your internal world. You start to understand what kinds of things make you get triggered and feel out of control, how to manage your own emotions, and how to tell the difference between your own emotional stuff and what you're actually feeling on behalf of your client. So you have to have they call it the capacity for self-reflection. You have to be able to both feel your feelings, reflect on your feelings, and put them into words all at the same time.
I think this is such an exciting time for psychology and for psychotherapy because we're learning so much so fast. We're learning about brain science, neuroscience, and there's this thing that you mentioned called emotion science.
Yes.
That is relevant to dealing with grief. What is emotion science?
Emotion science is actually a field of science where they've studied how emotions actually, where they show up in the body, what kinds of energy courses through the body when you're having emotions, what kind of information emotions actually are giving us as people. Because what we do know is emotions are evolutionarily useful. That's why we have them. And so emotions provide a lot of information, and emotion science studies what kind of information and how they work and how to regulate emotion. And by regulate, I mean, most of the time when we think of regulation, we think of tamping something down. But in regulation, it's more like a faucet. You need to learn how to both turn the faucet up to a gush when it's time to do that, and turn it down to a trickle, or turn it off when it's time to do that. And so so emotion science essentially studies all those aspects of emotion and puts them into useful language. So I can tell you how that applies.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
What's the relationship with this thing called polyvagal theory?
Yes, polyvagal theory is a theory that Stephen Porges, who's a scientist and a psychiatry professor, has has discovered and taught about. And it's a theory about the nervous system, and it kind of adds a layer to what we've known in the past about the nervous system. In the past, we've thought that when we're under threat, we go into fight or flight, and that there's just the sympathetic nervous system where there's fight or flight, or there's the parasympathetic nervous system where we're in calm. But what Stephen Porges has discovered is that there's actually three layers to the nervous system rather than just two. And he talks about how whether we feel threat or safety depends on whether we feel socially safe, socially engaged. So the top layer of our nervous system is the social engagement system, and that's a system that we share with all mammals, but not with creatures that are evolutionary lower than mammals. But when we feel socially safe, we can move up and down through our nervous system in safety, and that actually it doesn't hurt our bodies in any way. Even if we're in the sympathetic nervous system, which is about play and like sports where you get really aggressive and stuff, but you know that it's all playful, that's in your sympathetic nervous system and it's safe. Oh, but I should say the bottom layer is called the dorsal vagal system. That's why the dorsal vagal system is if you feel so much threat, you go into a collapse state, which is like when you see a possum playing possum. That's like feigned death, they call it. So if you are feeling under threat, like danger, you will go into fight or flight. But if you feel under so much danger that your body perceives that your life is threatened, you'll go into the dorsal vagal collapse state, which is like dissociation or depression or numbness, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So.
Okay. So now to get to the content of your ebook, starting with chapter 1, is entitled Unique Loss, Unique Grief.
Yes.
Everyone thinks there's a correct way to grieve, but you maintain that every loss is specific and every griever is unique. Can you speak to that?
Yes. As far as every loss is specific, it's very different to lose. I mean, there's different relationships we have with people, and there's different times of life where we lose people, and there's different stages of life that people die in. So the grief around losing, say, my husband traumatically suddenly when he was young and I had an infant, that kind of grief is going to be very different than if I lose my grandmother who lived a long, full life and lived out kind of a more expected lifespan. So there's a traumatic element to the grief around a kind of devastating young loss. There's also a difference between losing a spouse and losing a child. There's a difference between losing a child and losing a sibling. So each relationship and each type of life, there's a difference in having a loss due to murder or something also.
Do you ever help people get over the loss of a business or a relationship?
Absolutely. I think that if we had helped to grieve losses of businesses, loss of relationships, it would actually kind of expand our grief repertoire and our grief muscle so that when we have a larger loss, we have some familiarity with those feelings. We can even grieve a loss of a self, and a loss of identity.
Right. You point out in your booklet that John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, said, loss of a loved person is one of the most intensely painful experiences any human being can suffer.
Yes.
And you also point out that our society is death phobic.
Yes.
So it makes sense that we avoid grief if we're death phobic. But how can avoiding grief, how is it harmful?
Well, going back to emotion science, when they talk about how all emotions have an adaptive action that comes from the full expression of the emotion, that's the purpose of having the emotion. And and loss of any kind is like a gash to the psyche. It's like a wound. And you know how when you get a cut, say on your arm, your cells already start, without any choice on your part, the cells in your skin start to reknit and send growth factors and all that into the wound to heal it. When you have a wound in your psyche from loss, grief is the automatic process, like the automatic rebuilding of cells in a cut. Grief is the automatic process that flows through that wound and starts to knit it into healing. So if you avoid the grief, then it doesn't go away. It can turn into depression. It can turn into anxiety. It can cause you to shut down or surface later when you're having losses of other types. But go ahead.
Well, there's a lot of myths about grief, and you talk about them in your book, four major ones. And the first one that you mentioned is that grief occurs in predictable stages, and it takes about a year. Yes. How did we get that idea, and what's wrong with it?
I think we got that idea from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who actually proposed those phases of grieving for people who are dying rather than for people who have lost a loved one. So that was the first thing where we misapplied the phases, the stages of grief to bereavement rather than to dying. But I think that what ended up happening is my experience of American culture is that I think we come from pioneer stock. We come from people who survived here because they were can-do people who stayed strong and kept persisting through hard times to make it. So we have this kind of pervasive attitude in our culture that anytime something bad happens, you should just pick yourself up by your bootstraps and keep going and be strong and feel good all the time. And so I think there's a way that death causes us to have to face existential truths about things that we cannot control and about ways that we are going to hurt whether we want to hurt or not. Sometimes life is painful. Even though we don't like painful emotions, sometimes life hurts. But I think in our American attitude of can-do spirit, we latched onto those five stages of grief like a balm for that feeling of being out of control. It allows people to have the illusion that we can package grief, we can go through it with a checklist and make it through and get it done and feel better.
Right. We like to have a formula.
That's right.
Okay, myth number 2, that the completion of grief equals letting go.
Yes.
Why is that a myth?
Because there is a way that is something that I think actually came from Freud, where it's like when we lose a loved one, in order to move on, we have to finally put an end to our connection with that loved person. And we talk about closure all the time in our culture. And I think that's another piece of this attitude of wanting to make death and grief tidier than it is, to say that there's a point where you will be finished with your grief. That's one thing, where you'll be done, period, at the end of the sentence, and you will have resolved it and gotten that connection out of you. But what they actually have found is that many people are afraid to grieve because they don't want to let go, because what's actually the most helpful for most people, I'm not going to say everybody has to do it this way. I'm not a fan of prescribing anything as far as a way people should do it. But what tends to be helpful for most people is to develop internal continuing bonds with the person that you've loved. We have the capacity with our human brains, with memory and thought and everything, we have the capacity to actually connect internally with people who we remember. And so if we develop continuing relationships inside ourselves, it helps you to move through your grief, because you know that you are, even though it's not the same, you're carrying that person with you.
Well, that's very interesting and counterintuitive. I've never heard anybody say that. Mm-hmm. So myth number 3, grief that proceeds outside of some norm is pathological or disordered?
Yes. That's something that I think that again emerges from this attitude that we can control grief. I think that attitude that grief that is outside of some standardized norm is somehow disordered or pathological comes from my own field. It's from turning grief, using the medical model to turn grief into some sort of illness that we need to recover from. And what's harmful about that is that, one, returning to the first thing I said about grief, that every loss is different and every griever is different. Like we talked about how some people have more trouble with painful emotions than other people do because of their own childhood histories or being unsafe or not having time to spend time grieving because they're single parents and they have to work or whatever. So to say that everybody has to grieve in the same way is, one, just wrong-headed because all grief is different. And two, what does happen, and this comes back to the emotion science, that grief is a set of really intense emotions. And sometimes, in fact, many times, when you experience a loss in adulthood, it's the most intense set of emotions you've ever experienced. And so we all have our inborn and learned ways of managing big emotions that we learned growing up. And that kind of usually helps us make it through life day to day and the ups and downs of emotions day to day. But when we get slammed with grief, it pushes the emotions to be bigger than anything we've ever experienced. And so that can actually overwhelm our nervous system and make us have a hard time with the emotions. And what can happen is all those standard ways that we're used to handling our emotions don't work when the emotions are that intense. So some people might have like excessive grief that's too hard to get over, or they shut down and they can't feel their grief. And it doesn't mean there's something wrong with their grief. It means that the intense emotions have kind of like hooked into something that they learned about painful emotions growing up, and that's thwarting their grief. And if they could have some help, what it means is it's a dual, unfortunate opportunity to heal. You can have help to grieve and heal from this loss, and the information that this grief is teaching you about what gets you stuck when you're dealing with big emotions, that stuff can heal, and you can end up with a broader range of emotion than you had before.
And you point out in your booklet that is an incredible opportunity for growth.
Yes.
And instead of thinking that seeking help means you're sick or fragile,
right,
it's actually presenting you with a great opportunity.
That's right. And I want to be careful to say it doesn't mean you should be grateful for the opportunity, because people are really upset when they're grieving, and it's kind of like I like to say it's an effing opportunity for growth.
Well, it's hard to be grateful for pain,
right?
But sometimes it's an important signal,
exactly,
that points us in the right direction. Okay, myth number 4. If you seek counseling for your grief, it's an indication that you're weak or screwed up.
Right. That's another thing that ties back to our culture. If you're struggling, there's something wrong with you, or you're weak. But you know what else that attachment theory and emotion science show is that we manage and regulate emotions in pairs, right? We learn how to regulate our emotions with our parents when we're small. And when we have really painful emotions, what our social brains need more than anything is to be understood. So the very thing that will help us when we are feeling overwhelmed by grief is to be understood by another person. And so going to therapy to get help with somebody understanding you, even if you have a good support system, because you go to therapy and it's one-on-one and nobody else is worried about how you're functioning in the world, it actually soothes your whole nervous system.
Well, this is such a fascinating topic, and there's so much more we could explore, but we're basically running out of time here, and I want to make sure that we tell our listeners about your website so that they can go there and find more information.
Great. Yes, my website is candycecounseling.com. That's CANDYCE counseling.com.
Okay, so Candyce is spelled CANDYCE counseling.com.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Candyce. It's really been a pleasure visiting with you. I've learned a lot today, and I'm sure our listeners have too.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed being here.
For those who tuned in late, this is your Pathways host, Paul O'Brien, author of Great Decisions, Perfect Timing, a book that shares the theme of Pathways, which is personal and cultural evolution. In a second, I'll tell you how you can rewind and replay this interview anytime you like via the internet or as a free podcast. Just search for Pathways or Paul O'Brien and you will find it. Today we've been visiting with Candyce Ossefort-Russell, author of Your Grief is Your Own, Dispelling Common Myths About Grief. I want to say thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into the Pathways program, which is broadcast and streamed worldwide via KBOO.FM Sunday mornings at 8:30 USA Pacific Time. Podcasts of today's show, which you can listen to and forward to others, are available for free at divination.com. That's spelled DIVI nation.com, as well as via iTunes and other free podcast servers. This is Paul O'Brien reminding you to tell your friends about Pathways Radio and podcasts. And thanks again to Candyce Ossefort-Russell and to all of you listeners for tuning in and being a part of the Pathways experience.